The archives of television history are filled with stories of meteoric rises, but few match the subtle tectonic shift that occurred on the set of a nostalgic sitcom designed to capture a simpler era. When production initially commenced, the narrative blueprint was clear, anchored firmly around a wholesome, relatable protagonist whose journey through youth was supposed to serve as the emotional spine of the entire enterprise. Behind the scenes, two distinct worlds collided in the form of two young performers who arrived with entirely different baggage, training, and expectations for what their futures might hold. No one in the network offices or on the studio floor could have predicted how a minor background character would eventually fundamentally rewrite the cultural landscape of the decade. Yet long before the chaos of unprecedented fame disrupted the status quo, an authentic foundation was established between the two leads, built entirely on mutual respect and a shared commitment to the craft. This foundational connection was forged in the quiet spaces of early rehearsals, far removed from the screaming fans and overwhelming media scrutiny that would later define their public lives. Ron Howard stepped onto the soundstage carrying the rare, quiet confidence of an individual who had quite literally grown up in front of the lens. Having already successfully navigated the notoriously treacherous waters of childhood stardom on a previous landmark television series, he understood the precise mechanics of the industry with an instinctual clarity that few his age possessed. He knew how to pace a scene, how to interact with technical crews, and how to carry the heavy responsibility of a leading role without letting the pressure distort his professional demeanor. For him, the studio environment was not an intimidating monolith but a familiar home, a place where business and creativity blended seamlessly into a predictable daily routine. This deep-seated familiarity allowed him to anchor the new production with an effortless grace, providing a stable center of gravity that the creators desperately needed to launch their ambitious vision. He was the definitive professional, a reliable anchor who approached every script with a meticulous dedication to ensuring the story resonated with everyday audiences. In stark contrast, Henry Winkler arrived at the studio as an outsider to the Hollywood machine, possessing a background deeply rooted in classical theatrical training and intense stage discipline. He had spent years honing his instincts in prestigious academic environments, mastering the physical and vocal nuances required to command a live audience from the boards. However, beneath this polished exterior of theatrical expertise lay a deeply internalized history of self-doubt, fostered by a childhood of being severely misunderstood and labeled as academically deficient by educators who lacked the tools to identify his underlying learning differences. Every audition had been a battle against his own anxieties, making this major television opportunity feel less like a natural career progression and more like a hard-won chance at ultimate redemption. He brought a raw, hungry energy to the set, a fierce desire to prove his worth not just to the industry, but to the ghosts of his own past that whispered he wasn't capable. This collision of classical discipline and emotional urgency gave his performance an underlying intensity that immediately set him apart from traditional television actors. When these two wildly divergent creative forces were brought together to run lines for the first time, the resulting chemistry defied the standard calculations of network casting executives. Instead of creating a visible friction or a competitive distance, their contrasting backgrounds fit together with the precise elegance of a puzzle, establishing an immediate and unexpected balance. The seasoned professional and the hungry theater actor quickly discovered that they shared an identical work ethic, a mutual dedication to finding the absolute truth within the boundaries of a multi-camera setup. Their initial interactions were completely devoid of the posturing and ego-driven positioning that so often poisons new creative partnerships in the entertainment industry. Instead, they recognized in each other a kindred spirit, a fellow craftsman who valued the integrity of the scene above individual validation or vanity. This mutual recognition laid the groundwork for an artistic alliance that would soon be tested by some of the most intense cultural forces television had ever witnessed. As the earliest weeks of filming progressed, this creative alignment evolved into an almost telepathic shorthand that astounded the writing staff and directors tasked with guiding the episodes. On stage, the two actors developed an innate ability to read each other's physical language, adjusting their timing and delivery without a single word of explicit discussion between takes. A deliberate pause stretched out by one would be instantly met with a perfectly calibrated reaction by the other, ensuring that the rhythm of the comedy never felt forced or synthetic. If a line of dialogue shifted slightly in tone during a live recording, the partner would instinctively modulate his response to match the new emotional reality, preserving the scene's authenticity. Directors frequently marveled at how rapidly they could move through complex dialogue sequences, noting that the two performers rarely required multiple takes to discover the true heart of an exchange. This rare, unmanufactured synchronicity made their on-screen friendship feel completely inevitable to the millions of viewers who would soon tune in every week. The sheer depth of this instinctual partnership carried an immense amount of weight because both individuals consciously chose to leverage their distinct strengths for the benefit of the collective project. Howard's formidable professionalism, forged under the burning heat of childhood spotlight, meant he arrived each morning completely memorized, deeply focused, and entirely serious about the logistical demands of the production. Winkler, meanwhile, infused the set with a dynamic, unpredictable theatrical vitality, utilizing his physical training to give his character a distinct presence that leaped off the television screen. Winkler looked at his younger co-star not as a threat or a rival to be outperformed, but as a deeply valued teammate whose consistency allowed everyone else to take bold creative risks. He recognized that Howard's steady presence provided the safe narrative harbor that allowed his own character's eccentricities and high-energy mannerisms to work effectively. This mutual reliance created an environment where both men felt completely secure in their positions, fully trusting that the other always had their back. The subtle age difference between the two performers further reinforced this uniquely healthy dynamic, adding a layer of protective mentorship that shielded them from early friction. Howard was still navigating his late teens when the show began, experiencing the confusing transition into young adulthood under the unyielding gaze of the public eye. Winkler, being several years older and having already endured his fair share of professional rejection and personal hardship, possessed a mature perspective on the volatile nature of success. He understood deeply the emotional stakes involved in this high-profile gamble, and he intentionally chose to adopt a supportive, older brother stance toward his younger colleague. He actively sought to protect Howard from the cynicism of the industry, celebrating his triumphs and offering a steady, grounded presence when the pressures of production mounted. Howard would later reflect that this genuine warmth and lack of insecurity from Winkler made the early years of the show feel remarkably safe and collaborative. Away from the blinding glare of the studio lights and the demands of the network brass, the two spent hours meticulously refining their shared material in dressing rooms and quiet corners of the lot. They would dissect character motivations, experiment with physical comedy beats, and freely laugh over the inevitable mistakes that occurred during grueling tape days. The broader cast quickly began to mirror this egalitarian approach, describing the atmosphere on the set as deeply communal rather than rigidly hierarchical or competitive. The show's visionary creator, Gary Marshall, intentionally fostered this open environment, actively encouraging his actors to pitch ideas and take ownership of their characters' trajectories. This pervasive sense of collaborative freedom allowed the specific relationship between the straight-laced teenager and the streetwise greaser to evolve organically on its own terms. Neither actor approached their shared scenes as a desperate contest for dominance or screen time, viewing the work instead as a shared responsibility to make the human elements of the story truly resonate. During those initial seasons, the entire production operated under the comforting assumption that they were making a standard, heartwarming family sitcom centered on post-war Americana. No one involved in the day-to-day creation of the episodes could have anticipated the massive cultural hurricane that was quietly gathering strength just beyond the studio gates. There were no grand strategies or secret master plans to completely upend the narrative structure of the series or elevate one performer above the rest of the ensemble. They were simply a dedicated group of young artists learning their craft, adjusting to the unique rhythms of television production, and building a deep reserve of mutual trust. The set felt like a protected sanctuary, a place where creative experimentation was celebrated and personal bonds could grow without the distorting influence of outside commentary. The tragedy of the malicious rumors that would surface years later lies precisely in this pure, uncomplicated reality that existed before the world intervened. Before the media began to meticulously dissect every frame of the show for signs of jealousy, and before publicists framed their relationship as a fragile alliance, there was nothing fragile about it. The bond between the two actors was characterized by a quiet, disciplined professionalism and a deeply human affection that defied the typical clichés of Hollywood rivalries. They had built something genuine in the trenches of a grueling production schedule, a foundational respect that was entirely immune to the standard insecurities that plague competitive performers. This mutual trust would soon become the most critical asset they possessed as the forces of modern celebrity began to exert an unprecedented pressure on their lives. As the show's popularity began to skyrocket, transforming their everyday reality into a chaotic whirlwind of public adoration, the strength of this initial partnership would face its ultimate test. The scale of fame was about to tilt violently, but the foundation they had laid in the quiet early days remained completely solid. Part 2. When the unprecedented cultural phenomenon finally struck, it became immediately clear that the character of Arthur Fonzarelli was never intended by the network brass to become the primary axis of the show. In the earliest scripts, he existed almost entirely as a colorful, atmospheric side note, a leather-clad symbol of working-class cool who popped in and out of scenes to offer a sharp contrast to the main family's suburban earnestness. He was not designed to carry the heavy emotional weight of the overarching narrative, nor was he structured by the writers to drive the primary plotlines of the weekly episodes. In fact, conservative network executives were deeply anxious about his presence from the very beginning, worrying that his greaser aesthetic might alienate mainstream viewers or encourage juvenile delinquency. There were strict, highly specific mandates handed down from corporate offices regarding how often he could appear in his signature leather jacket, fearing it looked too menacing. The very visual detail that would ultimately define his iconic status was initially viewed by the studio as a dangerous liability that required careful management. However, the collective consciousness of the television viewing public possesses a unique unpredictability that frequently defies the calculated intentions of corporate executives. Audiences tuning in each week quickly looked past the surface-level archetype of the tough guy and noticed a compelling, layered vulnerability in Winkler's performance. They reacted deeply to the subtle flickers of loneliness that appeared whenever the character admitted his isolation, recognizing a deeply human soul beneath the carefully constructed armor of cool. Within months, the character, curated catchphrases leaped off the script pages and embedded themselves directly into the everyday vocabulary of the global public. Children across the nation tirelessly mimicked his physical gestures, while adults integrated his trademark phrases into their daily conversations, signaling a massive shift in the cultural zeitgeist. What had commenced as a modest, supporting utility role was rapidly evolving into one of the most explosive cultural phenomena in the entire history of modern entertainment. The sheer velocity of this sudden transformation was nothing short of staggering, completely overwhelming the show's original marketing and production infrastructure. Merchandising companies scrambled to capitalize on the craze, flooding retail markets with an endless array of products featuring the breakout character's likeness. His instantly recognizable face began to dominate lunchboxes, bedroom posters, board games, and clothing lines, transforming him into an unavoidable fixture of daily American life. Fan mail arrived at the studio doors in massive, unmanageable waves, completely eclipsing the correspondence received by the rest of the cast combined. National popularity polls consistently rank the character alongside world leaders and historical icons as one of the most universally recognized figures on the planet. In response to this undeniable groundswell of public obsession, the network's promotional machines began to radically pivot, leaning heavily on his image to sustain their soaring ratings. For Ron Howard, navigating this sudden and drastic realignment of the series was an extraordinarily complicated and emotionally challenging experience. He had anchored the production from its very first day, serving as the literal point of entry through which the audience explored this nostalgic universe. As the bright spotlight of public attention pivoted decisively away from his character, the broader industry's perception of his role within the show began to transform as well. Media outlets and entertainment journalists, always hungry for a narrative of conflict, began framing this natural evolution as a hostile displacement of the show's legitimate star. Howard found himself repeatedly facing invasive questions during press junkets regarding how it felt to become a secondary presence on his own television series. Even the behind-the-scenes suggestion from network executives that the actual title of the series might be modified to explicitly highlight the breakout character signaled just how dramatically the balance of power had shifted. Howard would later openly acknowledge that this period of intense transition caused him a significant amount of professional and personal pain. This distress did not arise out of a petty, malicious resentment toward Winkler as an individual, but rather from a profound sense of professional dislocation as the creative foundation he had worked tirelessly to build was publicly reframed. He had dedicated years of his life to establishing the narrative center of the series, and watching that center get casually repositioned by network executives eager for profit was a difficult pill to swallow. This vulnerability became the exact breeding ground where outside industry rumors began to rapidly solidify into an enduring Hollywood myth of a bitter backstage feud. Casual observers and gossip columnists automatically assumed that personal ambition, jealousy, and cutthroat tactics must be driving the changes happening on the soundstage. They gleefully imagined dramatic backstage shouting matches, private ultimatums delivered to producers, and calculated political maneuvering behind closed doors. The reality of the situation within the studio walls, however, was infinitely less theatrical and far more honorable than the public gossip suggested. Henry Winkler did not engage in any backroom campaigns for creative supremacy, nor did he ever demand that the show be re-engineered to serve his own ego. In fact, when the controversial proposals to rename the series began circulating among network executives, Winkler stood as a firm and vocal opponent of the change. He possessed a deep understanding of what such a heavy-handed corporate move would communicate to the rest of the cast, recognizing that it would publicly devalue the vital contributions of the ensemble. A compromise was eventually struck regarding equal billing in the opening credits, but once a narrative of toxic backstage rivalry takes hold in the public imagination, it becomes nearly impossible to reverse. Despite the noise outside, Winkler remained entirely committed to preserving the integrity of the workplace and protecting his relationship with his co-star. Inside the actual production space, the daily environment remained remarkably grounded, safe, and stubbornly collaborative despite the external pressures. Creator Gary Marshall continued to run the set with an open-door policy, inviting all cast members to contribute creative ideas and maintain their artistic agency. Directors consistently treated every single member of the core ensemble as an equal partner in shaping the specific comedic and dramatic tone of the episodes. The cast still gathered every morning to rehearse together, sharing meals, exchanging jokes, and functioning as a cohesive creative family unit. Yet, no amount of internal unity or behind-the-scenes professionalism could entirely drown out the deafening roar of speculation echoing from the world beyond the studio lot. Fame had fundamentally shifted the structural balance of the series, and once that line was crossed, public perception followed its own uncontrollable trajectory. This period of intense cultural saturation eventually led directly to a major turning point that took place near a quiet corner of the studio stage. By the time the series had progressed into its later seasons, Howard's long-held ambition to transition from acting to full-time directing was no longer a secret fantasy. It was a deeply serious career goal that he had discussed openly and frequently in dressing rooms, between setups, and during long production delays with those he trusted most. For him, performing in front of the camera had always been envisioned as the foundational chapter of a much larger, lifelong cinematic journey. Even as a child actor, he had spent his free time studying camera placements, observing lighting configurations, and asking technical questions of the veteran directors who guided him. This burning ambition did not emerge from a place of petty frustration with his current acting role, but rather out of a mature, long-term artistic vision for his future. When the moment finally arrived for that professional dream to manifest into reality, the gravity of the decision weighed heavily on everyone involved. Henry Winkler remembers that specific afternoon with an absolute striking clarity that the passage of decades has failed to diminish. He was informed by a production assistant that there was an urgent phone call waiting for him at a small, unassuming phone booth located near the stage's main entrance. It was a completely ordinary, mundane location for a conversation that would forever alter the trajectory of both of their professional lives. Howard was on the other end of the line, calling from a location away from the studio to deliver the momentous news personally before it broke in the trades. He wanted to ensure that his closest partner in the trench heard the truth directly from him, rather than reading it in a cold press release. This deliberate, respectful choice to call Winkler first carries a profound significance that effectively dismantles any lingering rumors of a toxic backstage rivalry. If there had been a genuine, deep-seated resentment between the two men, Howard would have undoubtedly maintained a cold distance, allowing agents and executives to handle the fallout. Instead, he chose a path of absolute courtesy, transparency, and deep-seated personal trust, laying his cards on the table as a friend. He calmly explained that he was officially making the terrifying leap, stepping away from the security of the hit series to pursue feature film directing full-time. Winkler has openly admitted that his initial, immediate reaction to the news was an instinctive, unfiltered wave of panic. For a brief, terrifying moment, he felt the air completely leave his lungs as he imagined walking onto that familiar set without the partner who understood his creative timing better than anyone else in the world. Part 3. The sudden realization that their daily on-screen partnership was coming to a definitive end left Winkler feeling momentarily untethered in his own professional skin. He instantly envisioned future scenes that would completely lack that comfortable, instinctual rhythm they had spent years perfecting together. In his own candid reflections on that intense moment, he recalled thinking that his professional life was effectively over, a dramatic but entirely honest testament to how much he relied on Howard's presence. They had navigated the confusing waters of sudden adulthood and unimaginable fame together in front of the entire world, and losing that daily collaboration felt like an immense personal loss. However, that initial wave of emotional shock lasted for only a few fleeting moments before a much steadier, more profound realization took hold. Winkler forced himself to remember every single passionate conversation they had ever shared regarding the mechanics of filmmaking and Howard's quiet, unyielding conviction. Winkler immediately pushed his own anxieties aside, looked into the future, and told his friend without a single shred of hesitation to take the leap. He reminded Howard that the art of directing was deeply embedded in his DNA, expressing his immense excitement to see the cinematic stories he would eventually create. There was absolutely no hidden bitterness buried beneath those supportive words, no passive-aggressive guilt trips, and no desperate attempt to convince him to stay for the sake of the show. This intensely private exchange completely dismantles the enduring public myth of a bitter, jealousy-fueled feud between the two actors. What occurred in the immediate aftermath of that phone call only serves to further confirm the profound depth of their lifelong alliance. When Howard subsequently secured his first major opportunity to direct a high-profile studio feature film, the studio's financial greenlight depended heavily on Winkler's star power. Studio executives, still eager to capitalize on the massive cultural footprint of the sitcom, believed that attaching Winkler's name to the project would guarantee box office success. Rather than letting ego dictate the terms, Howard approached his old friend with the screenplay, offering him complete creative flexibility to choose any role he desired within the story. Winkler, recognizing the immense stakes for his friend's directorial debut, read the script and enthusiastically agreed to join the project within 24 hours. The film moved forward into active production, ultimately serving as a critical and highly meaningful turning point in Howard's evolution into an Academy Award-winning filmmaker. This high-stakes collaboration was not a cynical, superficial public relations stunt designed to silence gossip columns. It was a practical, risky venture that required legal contracts and shared vulnerability. If a toxic resentment had been festering beneath the surface of their relationship, none of this professional history would have ever unfolded. Instead of a bitter ending, that quiet phone booth conversation became exactly what true turning points always are: incredibly painful in the immediate moment, but deeply transformative in hindsight. Their daily professional paths separated into different arenas of the entertainment industry, but the unbreakable foundation beneath their friendship remained completely intact. Sometimes, the most decisive and lasting shifts in human relationships occur in these small, unglamorous spaces, far removed from the glare of cameras. While Howard's transition into Hollywood's elite directorial ranks was highly visible and widely celebrated, Winkler's subsequent professional journey was infinitely quieter and fraught with unique challenges. He remained the singular, undeniable face most closely associated with the show's explosive cultural legacy, a level of visibility that quickly transformed into a complex double-edged sword. The iconic leather jacket that had once represented an artistic breakthrough slowly began to feel like an inescapable professional ceiling. Casting directors across Hollywood became so utterly blinded by the swagger of his famous character that they struggled to see the versatile, classically trained actor underneath. Scripts continuously arrived at his agent's office in massive stacks, but the vast majority of them merely offered cheap, uninspired imitations of the archetype he had already perfected. Winkler has spoken with heartbreaking candor about the painful years following the show's conclusion when meaningful acting work simply evaporated. He was not officially blacklisted by the industry, but he was profoundly boxed in by the sheer magnitude of his own success. This is the peculiar, deeply isolating consequence of achieving an iconic level of television popularity. The global audience embraces a character so completely that they refuse to grant the performer permission to inhabit any other human identity. Winkler found himself in the bizarre position of competing not against his contemporary peers, but against the permanent ghost of his own famous past. During the twilight years of the series itself, a significant amount of professional pressure had accumulated steadily within the walls of the production. As the breakout character's popularity continued to soar to unprecedented heights, the narrative focus of the series inevitably underwent a massive realignment. Veteran co-stars occasionally watched their own meticulously developed storylines shrink or get discarded entirely to make room for more high-energy plots centering on the breakout star. During grueling live tapings, minor professional frictions occasionally bubbled to the surface when comedic timing or highly coveted punchlines overlapped. Cast members like Anson Williams occasionally expressed passing frustration over specific comedic moments they believed had been inadvertently taken from them in the heat of a recording. Tom Bosley, who brought a veteran dignity to his role as the steady patriarch, felt the inevitable strain of watching the entire promotional apparatus focus exclusively on a single performer. When newer, younger actors were introduced to the cast in later seasons to inject fresh energy into the aging series, a subtle atmosphere of uncertainty inevitably emerged. These minor interpersonal tensions never resembled the malicious, dramatic betrayals that gossip columnists love to manufacture in hindsight. They were simply the completely ordinary expected frictions of a long-running ensemble working under the intense, distorting pressure of global scrutiny. Fame acts as a massive amplifier for standard workplace disagreements, transforming routine creative debates into sensationalized material for tabloid newspapers. Beyond the chaotic environment of the studio set, Winkler was also quietly processing a deeply profound, life-altering personal revelation. In his early 30s, at the very absolute peak of his global television fame, he finally received a definitive medical diagnosis that dyslexia had shaped his entire academic life. For decades, he had carried the crushing psychological weight of childhood humiliation, having been labeled as lazy, slow, and purposefully inattentive by severe educators and well-meaning family members. The clinical diagnosis brought an immense wave of intellectual clarity, but it also reopened deep-seated emotional wounds that he had buried beneath his performing persona. He felt a profound sense of relief discovering there was a legitimate neurological explanation for his reading struggles, but he also experienced a deep, lingering anger for the years spent in agonizing self-doubt. Even while standing at the pinnacle of international recognition, with millions of fans chanting his name, that deeply internalized childhood insecurity never fully vanished. The public looked at his character and saw the absolute definition of unwavering confidence, completely unaware that the actor underneath was still healing from a childhood spent feeling fundamentally inadequate. This stark internal contrast added a profound layer of human complexity to the false public narrative that he was a ruthless actor intent on dominating his peers. The man accused of aggressively overpowering others behind the scenes was actually an individual who had spent his entire youth believing he was incapable of keeping up with his peers. His enduring marriage to Stacy Weitzman served as his ultimate emotional anchor during this tumultuous and confusing chapter of his life. Together, they consciously built a deeply grounded, blended family, prioritizing the protection of their home from the toxic volatility of the Hollywood ecosystem. When Stacy faced severe health challenges, Winkler's personal priorities sharpened with an absolute clarity that made professional ambition seem entirely trivial by comparison. The glamorous illusions of Hollywood success lost their hold on him, replaced by a fierce dedication to the everyday realities of family life. Decades after the malicious rumors of a bitter backstage feud first surfaced in the tabloids, Henry Winkler and Ron Howard continue to describe their relationship using that same simple, unshakable word: trust. Howard has repeatedly stated in interviews that their lifelong friendship remains one of the absolute greatest gifts of his entire adult life. Winkler continues to view their legendary on-screen chemistry as a beautiful accidental miracle that occurred completely without cynical calculation. At public reunions and industry events, the absolute genuineness of their ease with one another remains completely obvious to anyone watching. They still laugh uproariously over old set rituals, celebrate each other's artistic milestones, and speak of their shared history with a profound, quiet reverence. In an industry notorious for its fragile alliances and discarded relationships, they have stubbornly remained the closest of friends for more than 50 years, proving that truth is infinitely more durable than headline-driven gossip.